So I guess I want to begin this conversation by asking you about your perspective on drawing and the kind of role of drawing in architecture. I mean, is it really just a tool for you to kind of articulate building concepts, or do you think architectural drawings have a greater potential, a sort of self-contained potential, maybe in the kind of vein of someone like Piranesi?
Well, I think there are two things involved there. There's the act of drawing, which to my mind is actually a form of thinking, right? It both facilitates thinking, but it is also a form of thinking when you are designing.
Yes.
And then once you have the drawing, whether it's a sketch or it's a full drawing, then the second part of that is what is the worth of the drawing itself.
Yes.
Right? Drawing is really understood as architectural representation. It represents the ideas that architects struggling with, trying to bring forth into the world. And that's why I think it is an act of thinking as you actually are designing. But also the drawing itself represents the process that you would have gone through in some ways. So I think even though a lot of architectural representation is done digitally nowadays, I mean, one of the things that I have done is to review the work of students at the Caribbean School of Architecture, and they draw almost entirely digitally.
Yes.
And it may be because of my age or my prejudices. I think there's something lost by not having your physical hand involved in the process. And it may be that is how architecture evolves. I mean, that there's no hand in the no literal hand in the thinking of how you're making something. So, but I do think there's something greatly lost by that, because there's a kind of a remove between your ideas and how you are making something and the actual physical act of building it, right?
Yes.
If you don't understand how something is going to be built, you can't draw it very well. You can't detail it very well. You sort of divorced from that process, and what tends to come out is in some ways a little bit unbuildable.
Yeah.
Particularly in the Caribbean context, where our construction technology is a little bit behind the world. You have to think long and hard about how you're actually going to make something, and understanding how buildings are put together, and then understanding how your part in that process works comes through in the drawings that you're making. And therefore I think it's still essential. I mean, after all of this time, it's still essential to do a drawing.
Yes. So I guess what you've kind of created this distinction here between maybe something that's a finished drawing which can be used to kind of communicate, and through creating that finished drawings, you might have a series of maybe less formal works that kind of help you to work through the idea. And this kind of idea of the developmental sketch being really crucial to the architect. This is something that's really been explored, and kind of gone into in many places around the world. And I think it's quite beautiful, this idea of the kind of sketch as maybe the earliest concept of the building, kind of, and then you kind of see the progression from that to something more finished. I suppose I was going to ask you as a follow-up question, maybe, how do you think you develop that capacity? To be more precise, how do you think you develop that visual thinking? Is it something that just happens through practice, or are there specific techniques that you think?
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, certainly, if you've never been exposed to it, then you're simply not going to develop it, right? But I do think that any architectural student understands that if you are given a problem to solve, that problem is almost always presented in terms of words on a page.
Yeah.
And your task is to take those words and those ideas and translate those into building forms.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to think about how those building forms are going to be made. and therefore the first thing you want to do is to reach for tools to help you move from one state to the next, right? You're going to be starting to think about it, about that process of translation, and as human beings, we like to use tools, right? So you can't just sit there and think a building into being, right? You've got to use some sort of tool to
work through it almost.
Exactly. And obviously for millennia, we have been, as architects, we've used drawings, which require manual skill in order to get us from this one place to the next.
Point A to point B.
So it's, and there's no substitute for just simply starting to do it. Just using, some architects draw very well, some architects don't draw very well. There's a big difference between, as you mentioned, Piranesi and let's say the sketches of Frank Gehry. But they're both using their hands and pen and pencil to help them think about how they get from their ideas into building via construction and via an understanding of how materials are going to be put together.
And so do you think maybe other kind of tactile processes like model making, maybe weaving, woodworking, do you think these are also viable substitutes for drawing, or do you think the primacy of the drawing kind of remains fixed?
Yeah, that's a good question, in the sense that with regards to the teaching of architecture, the teaching of what is referred to as the design process. Drawing has always been sort of
the standard.
Exactly. That does not mean that it is the only way of getting there, right? So people have in the past explored model making, of course. I mean, model making is extremely important. It depends on how you make the models, right? You want to allow yourself to be as open as possible, which is what a drawing does. But even model making, you want to allow yourself to be as open as possible to see where the process takes you. Collaging is another method that people have used as a way of getting from the idea to
something that construction you can interact with.
The drawings of someone like Daniel Libeskind are very interesting. They're very specific. Zaha Hadid used painting as a method of understanding how she was working. So there are other methods, and I think for any student going through school, the fundamental thing that you are doing in school is developing your own process. How do you get from ideas to construction? And whatever works for you works for you. I mean, I think that's what is important. It's like being, it's like training to be a dancer, right? I mean, if you train classically, it sort of opens up a whole set of possibilities for you to go off and do all sorts of other things. Or even if you're a musician, if you train classically, you learn the fundamentals of music theory and so on.
You learn the standard.
You know how to apply rules, you know how to break rules.
And that gives you kind of a base to work from.
Correct,
I think issues of representation are really fascinating, because it's that delicate balance between, as you said, something communicative and something sort of cognitive. So you're trying to balance the way you think through a project and the way that you eventually communicate it to the people around you. Because architecture is fundamentally collaborative. So at some point you're going to need to communicate this idea that you've developed. And so the role of the standard is very important, and I mean, personally, I think the role of the standard is quite important, as you mentioned. But then, as you also mentioned, finding your own way to develop a personal style or personal expression. And that tension, I think, is really beautiful. But I want to move on from maybe representation from a bit, if that's all right, and go to kind of maybe something that's a bit of a left turn from there.